Thank you everyone for joining us for this seminar. It's Basic Cannabis Concepts, Episode 1 of the Financial Poise webinar series. My name is Jason Tarasek. I'm a cannabis attorney with Vicente LLP. I live and work in South Minneapolis. I will be your moderator today. I work with cannabis licensees and tribal nations in Minnesota and Wisconsin. This webinar is part of the Financial Poise Cannabis Law Series. You can read more about Financial Poise on slide number 2. Here it is. And our panelists today are Seth Freeman with Glass Ratner, Chris Lindsay with the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, otherwise commonly known as Attach, and Jonathan Havens with Saul Ewing. Our bios can be found on slides 5 through 8. We will keep this conversational today, but I will try to remember to point out which slides our conversation is touching on as we proceed. Thank you to our co-producers, the National Law Review. You can read about them on slide number 9. This webinar is also sponsored by Daily DAC and Max Asset. Their information is on slide number 10. And the last thing before we begin, slide number 11 contains a disclaimer that just reminds you that you're not our clients. We are not your lawyers. What we're doing today is general education and not for you to act on without specific legal advice and an engagement agreement, a retainer, a sizable retainer, I'm sure. So with all of that housekeeping, we're going to dive into the meat and bones of our presentation. We'll try to have a little fun along the way. We'll definitely learn something. I know I will. So we're going to start on sort of from square one, indeed, talking a bit about the historical development of cannabis in the United States and frankly, worldwide, all the way up to early regulation in this country and to today. So I will ask Chris, Mr. Lindsay, before we get into sort of what's happening today, can you give us a little bit of a historical background on cannabis and hemp?
Sure.
No question. Just, the thousands of years of history, please.
Yeah, and it does. It sort of famously goes way back, thousands of years, and you can see preparations in tombs that really speak to it being used for a variety of purposes. It seems like at the same time that it was available for hemp and was commonly used as cordage and rope in cultures across the world, it's reasonable that varieties may have gotten noticed for other reasons, and they, by and large, seem to be related to religious purposes. But there are some that maybe that there was also just straight up recreational use, and we don't know, but humans are humans. And so in North America, the story is pretty linear until we get to the 19th century. And so in the in America, there's no recreational use of cannabis. That is not on the radar. It's not happening as far as any historical references can tell. It is 100% hemp in the sense of the industrial used as cordage and that kind of thing. It started to change in the 19th century. We started to see sort of formulations showing up in pharmacies, and that they were also sort of showing up about the same time we were going through kind of the snake oil era. And so to a certain extent, indirectly, it sort of led to some of the regulations that we ended up with it, even at FDA. But I want to hand this off to Seth because it does start to get a little bit more interesting once we get into more recent days.
Yes, it's pretty interesting that some of the same issues we're facing today in our society started off in the early 1900s and kind of reached a crescendo in around the mid 1930s. And the idea of people smoking and using cannabis was associated with Mexican immigrants and the creation of what was called yellow journalism at the time, and really started shifting public opinion about the fear of using cannabis. And what we wanted to share with you today is about a minute and a half of the trailer for the movie Reefer Madness, which some of you may not be familiar with, that came out in 1936. And this was also the time, frankly, when jazz music and a lot of stuff was happening in Paris and artists it's also partly related in terms of the social stigma of the time. And I'm going to see how good my technical skills are about sharing this on the screen. Whoops. Let's see if I can get this. Well, they were better a few moments ago when we were testing this. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let's see if we can get it rolling here. Let me just start this up again. 1 second.
Boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain.
Okay, 1 second.
Innocently, they dance.
Sorry, everybody. 1 moment. I've got it rolling here. Okay.
Boys and girls are having a hop at the local soda fountain. Innocently, they dance. Innocent of a new and deadly menace lurking behind closed doors. The burning weed with its roots in hell. In this film, you will see the ease with which this vicious plant can be grown in your neighbor's yard, rolled into harmless-looking cigarettes, hidden in an innocent shoe or watch case. In this startling film, you will see dopesters lure children to destruction.
We're going over to Joe's place. Why don't you come along? We have a date to play instead of doubles. Or you can play anytime. Come on, we'll have some laughs. Can I go along with you? Sure. Hey, I'll see you at dinner, Sid.
If you want a good cook, try one of these.
You will meet Bill, who once took pride in his strong will as he takes the first step toward enslavement.
Of course, it's your face.
Smoking the soul-destroying reefer, they find a moment's pleasure, but at a terrible price. Debauchery, murder, suicide. And the ultimate end
I think we I think we get the idea here. Now I have to figure out how to turn it off. So let's see here. So this is the end of the trailer. Whoops, losing total control here. So I'm sorry to our producers. This turned out to not be such a hot idea. There we go. The soon after this, the government decided to schedule marijuana, LSD, and heroin under the same category.
It seems like a good place to hand it off to Chris for more history.
Yeah.
Yeah, so throughout most of the 20th century, hemp was sort of still around. It was still out in the marketplace, but over the decades, as people started to really stigmatize marijuana further and further, the crop also fell off. The hemp crop also fell off. So by 1970, surprising nobody, they were ready to sort of make it sort of final. There had been several iterations of laws that the criminalization had been going on for some time, but it all sort of came together under one comprehensive bill that not only included marijuana, and by extension hemp, it also included the full array of drugs in the United States, and that's what we know today as the Controlled Substances Act. And so it's the CSA is kind of a living document. It gets updated almost in real time as new drugs come along, but marijuana has been squarely in it this whole time. And it's been put at the top of the sort of naughty list, the schedule of substances. So you get schedules 1 through 5, and as Seth alluded, it went into the same category that we see other drugs like heroin, and the ones that are considered to have just zero medical value and a real high likelihood that consumers could become addicted or use it in ways that are harmful. And so there it sat. Things did not really change until we got to 2014. And what happened was, up until this time, didn't matter whether it was hemp or cannabis or marijuana, whatever you wanted to call it, they're all the same plant. We're really only ever talking about different varieties, but these are, to the federal government during this time, it's all the same. It's very simple. 2014, we started to see a definition where they peeled off essentially varieties or versions of the plant that just only ever had trace amounts of THC as it was growing. And so these were not considered to be very attractive to those who wanted to consume them for recreational purposes. And it seemed like this might be an opportunity to introduce a new crop for American farmers. And so in the 2014 Farm Bill, now we have a definition of hemp that emerges. It allows universities to start to get involved with private, farm interests to develop this crop and decide whether or not this is viable. And by the 2018 Farm Bill, the decision was, yes, it is, and this should be something available to U.S. farmers. And so they modified the definition further. And today, now, at least technically, there's a marketplace for hemp, although things didn't quite go as planned. And this is, I don't want to get too far ahead, Jason. So
yeah, as planned. I'd love to know what that plan was, but yes, thank you for that. So we're hinting. That was foreshadowing. It's beautiful. We've got the viewers' attention now. So talking about the legal framework governing cannabis, I think, Jonathan, I'll throw this to you. There's been a lot of talk about rescheduling, and I'm sure a lot of folks are very confused as to what's going on in that regard. Can you try to explain exactly what may be happening? We were talking about the Controlled Substances Act, and explain what happened regarding rescheduling recently, please.
Sure, happy to. And good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. So, as Chris mentioned, all controlled substances fall into one of 5 schedules. Marijuana currently in the United States, despite the fact that many of you might see it around your neighborhoods in state authorized dispensaries, this is all federally illegal. And that's the conversation currently happening, which is, and when I say currently happening, we saw an executive order from President Trump last month, whereby he is instructing the Department of Justice, DOJ, to expedite this currently stalled rescheduling process. Here you can see this map, and you're looking here at which states have adult use, which states have medical, and then which states have no commercial cannabis at all. But way more than 50% of the United States has some form of cannabis. And so the current proposal is to move marijuana from Schedule 1, which is federally illegal for all purposes, to Schedule 3, which is federally legal for some purposes to those who have the appropriate registrations with the Drug Enforcement Administration. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, under which U.S. Food and Drug Administration sits, has already said in formal documents that it should be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. We're just waiting on the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, to issue a final rule. And I don't want to get too wrapped around the axle here, but suffice it to say, the DEA was starting to go down that path, or was thinking about going down that path with a proposed rule. And then there was a hearing process before an administrative law judge at the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the process has effectively stalled. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern, but there is a proposal on the table to move marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. Sure, we're going to talk about what that means, what it doesn't mean, but if you kind of hear nothing else as of today, unless something happened while we were doing this this episode, marijuana is still Schedule 1 federally in the United States, which means federally illegal for all purposes, despite the fact that many states have taken a different view.
And maybe I'll ask Chris, what is the significance of moving to Schedule 3? Why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is a unique feature of our tax code. So we've been talking about how they regulate drugs, and we ended up in our story at the Controlled Substances Act. But there are other acts, other parts of federal law that get invoked in all this, and tax law is one of them. And we have a very, very unique set of circumstances that have created a nearly untenable situation for businesses that are sort of in the business of touching the plant, is what we sometimes refer to it as. So what happened is, in the early days of the drug war, there was a person who had been busted running drugs from South America. And as happens, if you make money in the United States, you have a tax obligation. You have whether it's legal or not. And famously, Al Capone owed a great big tax bill, and they didn't bust him because he was a criminal. He had owed taxes, right? And so guess what? That applies all the way through and to the war on drugs. And so we had a guy got busted, and the IRS showed up with the butcher's bill. And so he went and ran his numbers with his accountant and declared his boats and his helicopters and his infrastructure, right? And the IRS said no, and he went to court, and the judge said he's got a point. And so what happened was Congress jumped right in, and nobody, it was not very controversial at the time, but they passed a law that said, if you're in the business of making money from trafficking a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 drug, you cannot avail yourself of any deductions that would otherwise be available to a business. And if you are in business, you can imagine the impact that has. And so a lot of the businesses in this industry, and I'm not kidding, will often face a net tax of 70, 80, or 90% of their gross. It's ridiculous. And so the question that we have around rescheduling often sort of falls into this, well, is 1 better than 3? And Jonathan no doubt can do a better job of kind of breaking down the realities of what that means. But the real get that happens, that the industry that I'm a part of is looking for, is to get moved out of that tax code provision from 1 to all the way out to 3. And now they can be treated like other businesses in terms of their tax exposure. And that is a huge difference to those who are in this industry.
Yeah, I will say the distinction that the Farm Bill drew between hemp and cannabis, and watching my clients on the hemp side of the equation, engage in interstate commerce and avail themselves of tax write-offs. I mean, the adult use cannabis side is very jealous of those opportunities. Seth, I'll ask you, Is there anything you'd like to add to these questions about rescheduling?
Yeah, there is all this excitement about the impacts on what's called 280E, and one of the uh, ways that cannabis companies have worked around this inability to deduct operating expenses is many businesses are structured with a holding company and or a propco and an opco, and have tried to shift what would ordinarily be a business's operating expenses into the holding company that doesn't, a propco that doesn't have um, that's not necessarily plant touching. And this has been the subject of a lot of concern because companies get audited and the IRS wants to say, no, this is an improper way to get around this rule and so forth. On the hemp side, um, one outcome of the Farm Bill was that a lot of farmers, especially in Kentucky, moved their crop from tobacco to hemp. And one of the motivations was the tremendous growth and interest in CBD products. And that's really what the hemp is intended to be used for, processed into CBD. And going back just 6 or 7 years ago, both hemp and CBD prices were very, very high. And they've since declined a lot. And it hasn't worked out to be such a great cash crop for Alabama, Kentucky, and other farmers. And it's created a lot of distress. And I think this is also something that of course, this administration is very concerned with.
Okay, sticking with rescheduling, Jonathan, I'll ask you, we're talking about the impact of moving to Schedule 3. What are some of the misconceptions that you sometimes hear about the impact of rescheduling?
Yeah, so there are many. In no particular order, one of the ones we hear is moving to Schedule 3 will federally legalize marijuana. And that is not true. It will still be very federally restricted. And there's this interesting handoff between the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the CSA, and State Controlled Substances Acts. States can, and we've seen this from the hemp context, states, even though that hemp is federally legalized, and I'm going to, in a second, I realize we keep using all these terms interchangeably. I think I'm going to do some 101 here language on what all these terms mean. But stick with me for a second. I promise we'll get back to the basics in a second. But if I don't finish this thought, it's going to go away very quickly. So some states, even though we have this 2018 Farm Bill that federally legalized hemp, say, no, we consider it to be marijuana and you can't sell it here. What the federal government has said in the hemp context is you cannot prohibit interstate commerce. So let's imagine you've got a truck full of hemp going from Montana to Washington State and it's going through Idaho. Well, Idaho has had one of the more aggressive positions on hemp. Idaho can't stop the truck at the borders, but they don't have to allow the truck to offload and have the truck driver sell the goods in Idaho if that's what they want to say as part of their Controlled Substances Act. So this is not going to force any state within the United States to legalize marijuana within their borders. What it will say is we're just taking away this federal prohibition for all purposes. It's not going to be federally illegal to do absolutely everything with it, but it's not going to force federal legalization. Unless and until Congress gets involved from some sort of an interstate commerce perspective, I think it's still going to be a large continuation of what we see now, which is states regulating the licensure of the growing, processing, dispensing of marijuana within their borders. But again, it's not federal legalization. I talked about interstate commerce. Think about these states speaking different languages and them not knowing how to interpret what the other ones are saying. Washington State's program is different than Montana's, is different than Illinois', is different than Florida's. And by the way, as you can see from this map that we have up now, some states are medical only, some are adult use plus medical, some are somewhere in between. So until there's kind of harmonization between these programs and until Congress says you can cross state borders, interstate commerce does not open up just because we move to Schedule 3. A lot of people like to talk about banking as well. We've heard that the bigger banks, the money center banks, the move to Schedule 3 is not in and of itself going to be enough to get them off the sidelines. You're going to need something like the Safer Banking Act, which has been discussed in Congress but has not been enacted and signed into law by the president. And so really the immediate impact is 280E goes away, as we've talked about, which helps a lot of our clients pay far less in tax than they're paying now. Not exactly the kind of misconception you were asking about, but people like to say, well, what do your clients care about tax? They don't even pay federal taxes at all because they're federally legal. I'm like, actually, they pay way more federal tax than any other industry out there at 70+%. So yeah, I think the misconceptions are that there's going to be a dispensary on every corner. You're going to be able to mail marijuana to your relatives, coast to coast. You are going to be able to transfer product from New Jersey to Illinois cannabis programs. None of that happens until there's follow-on action here. I promised I would do some terminology, so I'll do that, and then I'll stop rambling and let my co-panelists talk here. But I personally use the word marijuana to talk about the federally illegal substance that is the subject of all these state-regulated programs, meaning the products that you're buying at your local dispensary that are grown and processed into consumable products. Hemp, on the other hand, and marijuana is a kind of cannabis. So is hemp, by the way. They're both cannabis sativa L. Hemp, though, by federal definition, has such a low concentration of THC that Congress said in 2018, they really said it in a farm bill before that, but let's not get too confusing here. In 2018 said, as long as you've got cannabis sativa L with the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol or THC concentration of 0.3% or less on a dry weight basis, we're not going to consider that marijuana. We're going to consider that to be hemp. That's federally illegal. You can grow it. And there's not these punitive CSA penalties that apply to that. The lines have been very blurred since 2018 because now people are buying intoxicating THC beverage products, at big box stores. And people ask, are those federally legal? And I say, from a Controlled Substances Act perspective, sure. For argument's sake, let's say they're legal. My former employer, the FDA, says, nope, they're not, because you're putting THC into a consumable product. So if there's smoke coming out of your ears and you're confused, welcome to all of our worlds. Welcome to our job security. This is the world that we're living in.
I will say, before I ask Chris to follow up on that, in Minnesota in 2022, we simply defined edible cannabinoid products as hemp, and then we expressly said if you add it to a beverage or an edible product, it is not food, because that way we were able to avoid the FDA prohibition on adding cannabinoids to food. But Chris, tell me more about sort of some of the mischaracterizations of rescheduling and some of the myths perhaps we can bust.
Yeah, and this whole conversation is more complicated than it even would normally be, because we're sort of having what's marijuana, what's hemp, and then also what's the implication of rescheduling kind of all happening at the same time. And there are many ways they overlap, but there are some distinctions. And I'm going to zero in on one because I think it's important for those who are sort of tracking how the regulations are shaking out. When the formulation for the definition of hemp was sort of put together, this is going to be future law school classes are going to talk about. Here's the importance of being real careful when you're drafting, because what ended up happening was they created a definition that sort of set up conditions for not only a gray area, but for several ways to use a gray area to get products to market. And these products could very much to consumers look the same as those that had previously only been available in these highly restrictive environments and state regulated dispensaries. But now we started to see them emerge. And the problem is, again, you can, if law enforcement at the federal level has not been very active when it comes to marijuana over about the past 10 years. And there's a bit of a story behind that, but we're not really ever hearing about people, owners of dispensaries, getting hauled off in cuffs anymore. And that there was a time when that was happening. But it's been a while. And so now, as these hemp products emerge and seem to be adjacent, oddly, or somehow related to these marijuana products, there just wasn't very much of a law enforcement response. And the combination of sort of looking at the definition of hemp and its implications and what we might be able to do to wrap products around these definitions, and then a general lack of interest by law enforcement. And it just created conditions for a marketplace that took off. So now I'm going to try to bring this around to rescheduling, right? Because during this time, if you could claim that your THC product came at some point from a hemp plant in its chain back there somewhere, then you avoid 280E. You are no longer illegal to the federal government. You can ship your products across state lines. And for a number of years, states were totally unprepared for these products and had no anything in place, even to outlaw them or then to regulate them. And so all these things have come into place. And then suddenly now we're talking about rescheduling again. So what's I think for the most part that's happened is we've seen a situation in which a marketplace really wasn't well suited to the level of interest that consumers had. These programs tend to be highly restrictive. And what we got was a sort of course correction. We've got an expansion now. Kentucky and Texas were never going to legalize marijuana, but they have a regulatory system for hemp, and it'll get you just as high. And anybody that's traveling in California will be right at home in Texas in about 9 months, if not today. And so we're seeing, I think, state programs recalibrate, and the federal government, with one huge exception, which I'll get to, is going to see hemp intoxicants and marijuana as the same. And they have, for the most part, said, states, you deal with it. If you want to handle it, fine. We're not going to get in your way. If you want to ban it, fine. And I think that's where we're going to end up.
I do want to jump in real quick.
Yeah.
Governor Newsom in California actually wants to take away this hemp derivative kind of loophole. And so we may have to actually go to Texas to imbibe in those kinds of products a year from now, unless something changes. There is an important business implication of all of this, in that because it is federally illegal, and we've got all these different state laws, that companies that presently are really branding companies that have developed brand names for their gummies or brand names for their cannabis products presently license those names to separate state operators and state manufacturers. And they've had a lot of pricing power, especially for the brands that have really made inroads with consumers. And their business may change dramatically if with this move towards deregulation, in that they're going to have a completely different kind of pricing power over their brands if they're no longer able, and the producers are no longer required to sign separate licensing agreements on a state-by-state basis.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we've had this map up now for some time. Let's talk about the map a little bit. And Jonathan, I'll throw it to you. So we keep mentioning, of course, that marijuana is federally illegal. How is it then that these states are able to have legal adult use cannabis programs?
Yeah, so states have adopted laws, some states by voter, ballot initiatives. It somewhat depends on the state that you're in, but if you're talking about Maryland, the legislature passed a law. If you're talking about Florida, there's a ballot initiative. It somewhat depends on the state, but all of these states have gone through some sort of process, legislative or otherwise, to amend their state-controlled substances acts so that marijuana, in certain contexts, to people with the appropriate licenses, to consumers with the appropriate qualifying conditions, if you're in a medical-only state, can obtain products. It is highly, highly regulated. This is not like you go into your corner store and there's no security. It is completely the opposite. Just to give you a sense, even in an adult use state, and when we say adult use, some people refer to it as recreational, but we don't call alcohol a recreational product. It's an adult product. So why should we continue to stigmatize marijuana further? So let's just use my home state of Maryland. So Maryland is adult use. Really, it's adult use and medical, but for most of you that would walk into a dispensary, you would not know that it's dual. So you go in, you show your ID, there's lots of security. You cannot use a credit card. It is either cash only or some sort of a closed loop debit system. Again, the federal illegality stipulates that you cannot use a credit card. And our clients that we are advising in this space have spent a lot of money and a lot of time to apply for, obtain, acquire licenses, and there's very specific rules on how you do that. So it's very tightly regulated, and there's a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is these states don't want to give the federal government any excuse to come in and bust up these programs because they're violating federal law. There's a number of enforcement principles that is in a now rescinded federal guidance memo, but still somewhat the operating principles. But these states are very tightly regulating the activities within their jurisdictions because they don't want to give DEA and DOJ an opportunity to come in and bust up what is a revenue producing mechanism for a lot of these states.
I think that may have been a reference to the Cole memo, and maybe Chris, I'll ask you. This definitely is getting a little wonky, but it's important, I think, to recognize sort of the tenuous nature of this entire adult use cannabis market nationwide. If you could address that and anything else you'd like to address with regard to the federalism at work with regard to legalization.
Yeah, it's people don't, I think, understand how precarious the world is in which we live. I come from the olden days when business owners were worried when they went to sleep at night that DEA would come after them, and there wouldn't be much of a defense if they did. This whole strange situation where the federal government completely outlaws this stuff for basically every reason, any reason, and states are just like, you know what, we're going to set up a program and it's going to cost $1 billion to participate, and just they're like generating revenue. That comes to us as kind of a feature of federalism. The federal government, we're technically peers to each other, states and the federal government, technically peers. The federal government can't make states make something illegal. So it's not like a military where you have ranks or a corporation. It's, states can kind of go their way. There are some lines, and this sort of builds into this peculiar arrangement we have around this stuff. But states can't prevent the federal government from enforcing its own laws. And so you end up with a really tough spot. And that's, Jonathan indicated, you have these highly regulated programs. And it's kind of like, nothing to see here. Like we're doing it all, sunshine on everything. And to a certain extent, there are protections. There's actually a rider that was added to a spending bill 11 years ago, Rohrabacher-Farr. And what it does is it says that if you're a business and you're in compliance with your state program, and if you're in one of the enumerated states, the DOJ is basically defunded when it comes to enforcing against you. And DOJ didn't like that very much. They did some further enforcement, ended up in court in the Ninth Circuit. Maybe not the best circuit for them, but they nonetheless went there, and the Ninth Circuit was like, yeah, that's what the law says. And they made a point, which was there's not much difference between medical marijuana and adult use marijuana. So what are we supposed to do? And the court said, you should talk to Congress. And we haven't seen very much of anything against either adult use or medical marijuana operators since. Now, there was a memo that came out that was the first time the federal government actually came out and said, here's some kind of rules of the road. And to be clear, the whole last page of it was, and don't count on any of this if you get in any real trouble. But the first 3 pages were like, gold. And so it sort of provided some guidance. And that's part of what built these highly regulated programs that Jonathan was talking about. So we sort of had this weird place where federal government just hates it, but it's not really enforcing and almost now expects states to deal with this stuff. States have kind of spun up these hyper regulated programs, and then hemp walks in and is like, guess what? We don't have to do any of that because we're federally legal, vaguely. And so that's the crazy marketplace and landscape that we've been in for the past 5 years or so.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Cole memo applies to the states. There's a companion called the Wilkinson memo that applies to all of our Native American tribes. It's nearly identical in the enforcement guidelines. Seth, anything to add on this federalism concerns?
No, I think we've got a good grasp of it now.
Great. Well, I think anyone reading the news recognizes that cannabis, both marijuana and hemp, have been in the news in ways that at the federal level anyway, that simply are unprecedented. It's been a quiet time at the federal level, but of course, with the rescheduling talk, it's been major shockwaves. And then we've touched on how the Farm Bill changed the definition of hemp and expressly legalized it and took it off the Controlled Substances Act. But then there was a shock along those lines as well. So Jonathan, tell us a little bit about what happened to intoxicating hemp at the federal level relatively recently, please.
Sure. Yeah, just one quick point. Chris was talking about medical versus adult use. Another misconception is the Controlled Substances Registry is for therapeutic products. It's not for adult use products. And so one of the big questions coming out of this is, if we actually move to Schedule 3, what does that mean vis-a-vis compliance for all these state regulated operators? Because many of them are in dual use states, adult use and medical, right? So is half of their business then arguably federally authorized, legal, and the other half isn't? Is there going to be enforcement? The answer is no. As a former federal regulator myself, I can tell you most of these agencies, all these agencies, aren't sitting around flush with cash and personnel to just go after new product areas. Again, Congress is going to need to get involved here. So we might not see a lot of difference other than less tax being paid from folks in this industry. Back to your question, Jason, though, on hemp and some developments in this space. So although a lot of us would like to forget it, our federal government was shut down for I think it was either the second longest or the longest period in history. And last fall, the spending package to reopen finally the federal government contained, somewhat surprisingly to many, a ban with delayed enforcement. It wouldn't go effective until November of this year on these intoxicating hemp products. So in the wake of the 2018 Farm Bill, we heard a lot of questions from operators in the hemp space saying, well, can we sell THC products as long as these products have that 0.3% concentration of THC or less? And under the Farm Bill, it seemed the answer was yes, except then people were making, for lack of a better phrase, very heavy products. So if you have a drink, right, a drink that's this size, or a large can, 16 ounces, you could have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 milligrams of THC in there. And as a concentration of the entire product, the THC versus the total weight, it might be 0.3% or less. It probably will be if the product is very heavy. I can tell you, I don't think Congress really intended on it being a finished product measurement. This was a farm bill, an inputs bill, a crops bill. That's the 2018 farm bill. But industry moves very quickly, much quicker than Washington for that matter. Congress finally got fed up, or I should say a couple people in Congress finally got fed up or were lobbied hard enough to get fed up enough to put something in this spending package to reopen the federal government. And essentially, that spending package said you can no longer have these intoxicating hemp products. You can have no more than 0.4 milligrams of THC per container, which, again, not enough to have that intoxicating effect. So the sky is falling for industry. People are panicking. People are selling off products. Investors are pulling out. And then all of a sudden, we get back to this executive order that President Trump issued. And the headline of the executive order was marijuana rescheduling. But for folks in the hemp industry, the headline for them was President Trump saying, I want someone on my staff, and he identifies them by position title, to work with Congress on evaluating some sort of an upper limit for THC in products and sort of reopening this discussion on intoxicating hemp products. Let me just step back and tell you what the takeaway is, because you're probably wanting less detail and more what are the Cliffs Notes. Here are the Cliffs Notes. The notion that we are going to have an in-force intoxicating hemp ban come this November, first of all, I thought was always a bit unlikely. Now that the White House, through this executive order, is having White House staff work with Congress on how do we actually regulate these products or reevaluating this ban, I think it's even less likely. And I don't think we're going to see an in-place, enforced ban of intoxicating hemp products come this November.
Wow. How about that? What do you think about that, Chris? Making news here.
Well, I have actually quite a bit of different perspective on it. One of the aspects of the definition of hemp was it included a term in there. It said not only was hemp biomass removed from the Controlled Substances Act, but something that you could derive from that would also be removed, including cannabinoids. And Mitch McConnell and those with the pen didn't consider that you could take cannabinoids that are naturally found in a plant that would be defined as hemp using the 0.3% in the field and just go into a laboratory and turn it into a different molecule. And so you do that by stripping CBD down and then cooking it in battery acid for 24 hours and then building it into a new molecule, which would be delta 8 THC or delta 9 THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana. Could be delta 9 THC, or you can take those and convert them further and end up with things like HHC, THCP. You can spin off what are called different versions of THC. And so when people are getting delta 8 gummy and they're told that it's hemp derived, it's gone through this process. And so that is not the same thing as marijuana. And the problem that we have is that all of the rescheduling discussion, the evidence that Health and Human Services provided and the analysis that DEA provided were based on marijuana. They were not based on THC that had been converted from CBD. And so I don't think that we're likely to see rescheduling applied to those products that would be based on CBD conversions. And the problem that you have fundamentally with hemp is that it's not intoxicating. That was the point of defining it as hemp. And so to get a marketplace based on hemp intoxicants, I believe is largely based on CBD conversions. And so I think what's going to happen is that over this next year, we're going to see ancillary services drop off. We'll see carriers less interested. We'll see banks less interested. We'll see landlords less interested. And I think these businesses are going to end up having to recalibrate. They're going to have to start using real biomass and whatever THC they can derive from hemp. And there are ways to do it. You just need a field big enough. If you can have 0.3% delta 9 THC, you can get there. But that's not is what's driving the marketplace now, because it's a lot cheaper to do it in a lab. And so I think we're going to see a pretty big shift in the marketplace, just because the operation of federal law and the limitations they're going to have when they declare that marijuana has been moved to Schedule 3. The record isn't going to support anything but natural THC.
Yeah, well, I will just tell you that I am seeing a lot of my clients in the hemp space jump over into the adult use space simply because, shockingly, there's more certainty in that area now. Steph, maybe you could talk about what you're seeing among your clients. We're all making prognostications now as to what will happen with intoxicating hemp. Love to hear what your thoughts are on that.
We're in a time where it's very difficult for marijuana operators to raise capital, and capital that is available is expensive. So I agree with Chris in terms of some of these CBD hemp derivative retailers, for example, and some of the processors looking at recreational marijuana. But there's just not a lot of money available from funders, and it's still very expensive to build out a facility and so forth. And one thing we didn't talk about too much, and I don't know how it is in other states, but in California, cities also regulate cannabis operations. And one of the reasons it's been very expensive to go into this business is that generally there's just designated spaces or land use areas where where a growing facility can be located, or restrictions on where a dispensary or retail business can be located. And those kinds of kind of structural problems aren't going to change from rescheduling. So I think there's some real sort of on the ground core operating issues that aren't going to go away. What might change that will make being a bigger business, a bigger cannabis business, less expensive to operate is if the larger cannabis companies don't have to that are listed in Canada no longer have to be listed in Canada, and their public companies can move to the United States, and that will simplify a lot of reporting and also simplify creditor enforcement, which in turn will increase the amount of capital available. So I think that's one implication.
I will say, when I was working with our legislators in crafting our legalization bill here in Minnesota, we saw, I guess, what could happen in California when you allow local governments to opt out. The illicit market is happy to fill that vacuum. So
Right.
we did not allow that. But surprise, surprise, local governments still can find ways to make it difficult for licensees to set up shop if they are really hell-bent on it.
At the beginning, a lot of states and cities wanted to get involved with this because they saw a lot of tax revenue that was going to come in, and that was really one of the big motivators. It really wasn't some form of social enlightenment. It was motivated by wanting to generate tax receipts, and unfortunately, many cities and states have made it so expensive for a legal operator to be in business.
I have a question. We're talking a lot about rescheduling and perhaps the demise of intoxicating hemp. Do you think rescheduling and the fact that the cannabis businesses themselves will become much more profitable by eliminating the 280 tax penalty, does that help loosen up some investment money, do you think? Anybody who would like to comment on that?
Look, I think cash has been very expensive in the space because there's not traditional banking. You're talking about smaller, state and local credit unions, not the money center banks. To the extent these cannabis businesses are paying their full freight and taxes, that's a webinar for a different day of what marijuana companies are doing vis-a-vis their tax positions with the IRS and working with their accountants. But let's say they are paying their full freight and taxes, that 70+%. If they're able to pay general corporate, rates, yeah, it's going to free up a lot of cash, whether that's for, investors, whether paying back investors, whether that's for expansion, whether that's so that they can consistently pay their employees or, what normal businesses do here. Yeah, absolutely. I think it could help the cash position of the industry. And the other thing is, and we didn't talk about this, but, the federal illegality of the space prohibits freedom within the trademark and patent space, more so on the trademark side. But when all these products are federally illegal, your real estate, so to speak, and I don't mean your land real estate, I mean your brand real estate, your options are much more limited. So there will absolutely be way more financial incentive to participate in the space. Frankly, more vital operations in the space. Cannabis industry right now, you can't declare bankruptcy because that's federal protection, but state receivership is one of the hottest areas in cannabis right now. So it's because this industry has been waiting desperately for federal reform that has just not come as quickly as a lot of people thought.
Any other thoughts, Chris, Seth?
I would just say real quickly that, when we talk about banking, we often sort of think about having a bank account, and that's definitely important. But one of the aspects that's not as really discussed as much is that no institutional lending. And so you end up having to go to the few VC firms that are willing to bankroll marijuana companies. You can imagine that's not cheap. And so just having more that ability would be enormous. But the problem is that banks are conservative. You're not going to get a more conservative institution than these, right? And so Schedule 3, we're still off label at best to the FDA, right? It's not much different than we all open a recreational steroids store. That's not legal. It's Schedule 3. There's no version of that a bank's going to be like, I'm in, right? And so we're still going to have that challenge, right? And so safer banking is going to make a big difference, but it's still at its fundamental doesn't remove this stuff from the schedule. And you need a doctor's prescription, and you need to be using it on label if you're on the schedule. So to be treated like alcohol, which is what a lot of people sort of think we ought to do, means a framework, and you come off the schedule. And that's the row that has to be hoed ahead of this industry, is we've got to create those things.
And I would add that the alcohol industry is not that excited about that outcome.
Okay, well, looks like we're at time. Maybe I'll give, I think the prognostications were pretty interesting to me. Maybe everybody, a final thought, prognostication, what does cannabis look like at the end of 2026? How is the adult use market doing nationwide? How is the hemp market doing nationwide? Final thoughts. I'll start with you, Jonathan.
I think the hemp industry looks at the end of this year exactly how it looks today. I think marijuana gets rescheduled before the end of the year. And not much changes immediately other than 280E falls away. And Congress has its work cut out for it. And that's interesting because Congress isn't known for its activity in this space or many other spaces at the moment.
Okay, Chris.
I think it's going to be a little bit more restricted than that, but potentially not much. I mean, nobody wants to stop consuming cannabis, whether we call it hemp or marijuana. That's going to be around. What we're often talking about is what's the best way to regulate what's going on anyway, right? And so that's that in the biggest picture. 300 years from now, it's no change, right? We can argue, and that's going to be interdenominational arguing.
And I would say the wheels in Washington move very slowly, and those of us who follow the industry can get really excited by these different announcements, and you can see the public cannabis companies' stock prices popped and then settled down with the realization that this is going to be continue to be a really slow process with very tiny incremental pieces of news. So I think the end of 26 is, we have a few distractions in the present day that I also think aren't going to change. So I think beginning of 27 is going to look just like today,
Wow. All right. Well,
unfortunately.
well, thank you everyone for your time. That was interesting to me. I hope it was interesting to our viewers, and appreciate it. I hope you all learned something, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.